kind of studying a lot of great artists, from Ansel Adams to some painters to some magnificent painters to even poetry, really. And what's interesting is a lot of great artists didn't necessarily start out as great artists or necessarily were very well known until nearly the end of their life in most cases, until after they passed. And one of the interesting things that kind of studying creativity and learning about what makes people creative, and as well as what makes work last, creativity is kind of difficult to define, yet a lot of people have come up with ideas or reasoning. The Greeks had a very interesting concept of creativity. They didn't think artists or artisans necessarily were creative people themselves. It's more of they believed in a muse, and it's essentially the idea of having this, creative being who is essentially your essence, the source of your creativity, kind of channeling it to you and giving you that creativity. And I thought that was kind of interesting because when you talk to other artists or other creatives about, let's say, how they became creative or how they came up with some, work of art that's really memorable, there's a couple things that come up. And so, kind of having gone through and studied a lot of great artists themselves, I thought I'd kind of give my 2 cents. How to make art memorable and last. So here are 5 recommendations on how to create lasting art. First lesson, simplicity is key. So Hemingway was kind of criticized quite a bit about his writing. And it wasn't necessarily that it was bad, it was just that he used a lot of simplicity. He didn't necessarily use any complex structure of sentences, paragraphs, or even words, really. And to his credit, he always wanted that. He always wanted to have very simple, timeless words to use that wouldn't overly complicate anyone for their writing. And so I remember once he said that he wants to relate to people. He wants to relate his stories and his characters to be very simple, but also extremely relatable. So whenever you read any of his stories, like The Old Man and the Sea, the story isn't anything fascinating. It's more of just an old man literally confronting the idea of his own mortality, being old and getting older, by going out to sea and catching a fish. His idea is he still has what it takes. He wants to prove to himself. And so one of the things about making really great art is that you need to be simple with your execution. It doesn't always have to be overly complicated or overly elaborate or anything. No, it could be very simple, and I think that's what really conveys the message across. Tip 2, draw inspiration from a lot of different sources. Specifically, if you have other sort of ideas really about simplicity, one of the best creatives to look at for simplicity is actually Leonardo da Vinci. It's synonymous with the idea of creativity. And he's actually well known for the idea of kind of always being curious about everything around him. In his journals, he wrote, one of his greatest inspirations was nature itself, and you could actually read this. So he writes in his diary that nature was his greatest teacher. And looking at a lot of his notebooks, you could actually see that he wrote little snippets of observation about, for example, his birds taking flight when he took in his daily walk to the park, or how he observed observations to us kind of seem trivial, but at the time what was interesting is he was studying muscles and muscle movement. And so with that idea, he was able to study how birds moved, and it actually inspired him to create a machine that mimics the movement of birds in flight. I'll kind of put up a an interesting photo of it. It doesn't necessarily work, but eventually what it was interesting is that it led to the idea of how the Wright brothers actually developed the first plane. Is they also noticed how birds and other flying creatures would essentially kind of lift and glide, if you will, through the air. And so that's kind of one of the tools that, one of the ideas that they actually used to actually create the first flying machine. Tip 3, find your niche and focus. So in marketing, there's a term called the T-shaped specialist. And really what that means is that you know a lot of different things, but you're very specialized in one little subject. For example, one of the most famous scientists in the world, Richard Feynman. He was very well known for his understanding of chemistry, physics, mathematics. But what makes Richard Feynman really interesting is that he was a very devout specialist in his specialized field of quantum mechanics. And he used that knowledge to really focus in on his specialty, which was quantum electrodynamics. And it was interesting because he was able to draw in a lot of concept from various fields to essentially create the most specified field in physics. And so what I find interesting is that in order for other people to essentially create great art, I've noticed is that they become a T-shaped specialist, where a lot of people create, let's say for example, a painter, take Andy Warhol for example. He took a lot of portraits of different people, but his specialty was creating more of a pop art, a caricature almost of his art. And so that's very interesting. So for anyone in any sort of creative field, I would suggest becoming a T-shaped specialist. So if you want to become a photographer, what kind of photography do you want to do? And from there, what kind of, let's say for example, if you want to do portraits, what kind of portraits do you want to do, right? Tip 4, blend a couple different niches. So speaking of Andy Warhol, what makes him fascinating is that he was one of the most prolific artists of the 20th century. And what he really liked to do is that he dove into a bit of different arts to essentially draw inspiration. But what was interesting is that they fed off each other almost in a way. And so because he was a photographer, he really enjoyed directing film and all these other things. It really led to him developing his own painting style, or let's say for his other sort of printing process of art. And so it's very interesting how you could kind of blend different things together. Another good example would be Picasso, for example, his blue period, if you will. It's kind of a meshing of using only one color and also using only the Impressionist style. So instead of making it realistic, it's almost making it unique in its own field. And so he blended a couple different things to make his art really stand out. And so I think that's fascinating, and I think other creatives could also take that into effect, where you could blend, instead of creating something completely new, why don't you blend two different ideas or several ideas together? I'll take one of my favorite directors, Guillermo del Toro. He takes in fantasy, horror, and fairy tale style of directing and creates these very beautiful, really, works of art for his films. So film of Shape of Water, he blended the idea of a monster, a love story, as well as kind of a very skillfully crafted almost horror. What's interesting about this movie, and I think it's beautiful, is that the monster and the main character actually fall in love, and it's the story about them trying to figure out how to be with each other, which was almost the exact opposite of what a lot of monster movies are about. So I highly suggest this movie. It's very beautiful. So for the last, I guess, like central tip or idea that I found is creativity is a habit, and in order to perform have a habit, you have to be consistently creating. And it doesn't have to be necessarily perfect, but having that creative muscle always flexed essentially increases your ability about creating itself. And I don't think creativity necessarily always has to be something completely fascinating or something completely new as compared to the other tips. Creativity could also be something super simple and very bland in a way, where the blandness or the simplicity is art itself. So take one of my favorite painters, Jan Vermeer. So he was a Dutch painter who essentially just painted still lifes. One of his most famous work is actually the lady with the pearl earring. And, you know, just looking at this, it almost looks like just a simple portrait of just any girl that would live in his neighborhood. And he just painted her very simply with just a pearl earring. But what's beautiful about it is that looking at his other works of art, they're all super simple, but what's fascinating is that he drew and painted about everything he saw. To any artist, ask a photographer, how do they get better at doing photography? Constantly taking photos. For every, let's say, 1,000 photos, there's one really great photo. Ask any writer, how many times do they have to write their screenplay or rewrite their novel? The more and more you craft and edit this work that you're working on, the better over time it comes. So I hope you guys really enjoyed it. Those were kind of the 5 key takeaways I've noticed kind of studying a lot of great artists. You know, art is a bit subjective, but at the same time, you could also make a case that in order for art to last consistently, you as a creator and artist have to consistently be putting work out there. So, you know, I hope these tips help. If you like this video, hit the like button. And if you really like videos about creativity, storytelling, photography, these sort of things, you know, subscribe to my channel. Hopefully we'll be talking about more stuff like this. All right, catch you in the next one.